Hello, everyone. You're listening to the Paradigm Shifts podcast with your host, Keisha Kruger. I'm an organization development practitioner and executive coach, working with leaders to create positive changes in the workplace using behavioral science. My personal mission? Share science-based tools and leadership insights from the field that you can use in the workplace and beyond. Considering we spend about 3/4 of our lifetime at work, there is incredible science and organizational psychology that can be used to rethink the way we work, lead, and ultimately live. Join me as I speak with thought leaders and business leaders in practice, unpacking light bulb moments for paradigm shifts. Hi there. On this week's episode, we're chatting with Dr. Jim Maddox. Jim is a change strategist and an assistant teaching professor and graduate program coordinator for the Human Resource Development Program at the University of Arkansas. He has a master's degree in industrial and organizational psychology and a Ph.D. in human resource development. Jim is a certified management trainer with Zenger-Miller and Achieve Global and a registered organization development consultant. His current research focuses on organizational self-awareness, facilitating transformational change in developing communities and organizations, and exploring the construct of resistance to change. A link to his most recent book, Embracing Resistance to Change, can be found in the show notes. Enjoy. Hi, Jim. How are you?
I'm good. How are you today?
Good. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm so excited to talk with you and chat with you about your book.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. This is, I've had my podcast for the last couple of years, but this is the first time I've been on somebody else's podcast. So I'm much more nervous on this end than on the other side. You would think I would be comfortable, but yeah.
Well, this will be a good experience for you. So now you'll have a different paradigm when you are hosting the future interviews because you'll know what it's like to be in the hot seat.
Much more empathic.
Well, I'm excited to talk to you about your book, Embracing Resistance to Change, and I have it here. But before we dive in, there's this beautiful story in the book that it's a really relatable one that you kind of open and set the stage of your book in about you uprooting after grad school. And I just want to understand a little bit more. Can you share that story with everyone? Because it's just so beautiful and it's just such a new way to think about change.
Yeah, it's a great example of how we sometimes don't apply what we do, and so here I've spent my career studying change and the paradigm of resistance and just really pride myself on when I facilitate or consult or coach, I really take an inclusive approach, and I really focus on how do you get all the voices in the room. And here, when I uprooted I have 4 kids now, but at the time had 3, uprooted those 3 small kids to move from the home that they own, the only home they knew. I didn't stop to think about that they might resist the move. I just assumed that they would be excited. The one thing we took care of was we made sure that they saw us packing their toys. They got to keep their favorite toys. So they saw everything go onto the truck. So we thought that was good to go. We were super excited about the house that we were buying because it had a massive swing set in the backyard that the people had just gone overboard. It was like they just kept building on with the wooden structures. And it came with the house. I don't know that we ever would have put in that big a swing set.
Yeah.
And, the swing set in the house that we were moving from, the house was like 60 years old, and the swing set was probably that old.
Wow.
Old, metal, rusty. It had 2 swings, and it had a little ratty slide. And then the structure itself had a short little span from one end to the other. It was only like 6 feet long. And it was monkey bars above the top, and then the 2 swings and an old metal slide that was like 3 foot tall. We thought they're going to love this new swing set because it had a glider, it had a merry-go-round, it had a fort, it had a bridge. It had like 10 different pieces that had all been like taken over half the backyard. And in fact, the neighbor said, "Hey, can we still come into your backyard? Because that's kind of been a neighborhood park."
Oh.
And we're like, "Oh yeah, that's fine." So we get there. The kids are like, we're getting moved in. They get their rooms. they're out in the backyard, and we're like, what do you think? And they were just kind of like glum. And we're like, what's going on? I'm like, you guys should be excited. This is so much better than your old swing set.
Yeah, it's huge. It's got more things than
And they're like, no, not really. And I'm like, what's going on here? So we just sat down and was like, hey, why don't you like this new swing set? And they're like, well, it doesn't have monkey bars. They picked the one thing that it didn't have. I'm like, well, what? It's got everything else. Why do you need monkey bars? And then they proceeded to tell us these adventures that they had in the backyard around those monkey bars, and how they, would traverse ravines and get away from wild animals, and just, they had this whole narrative around that one aspect that we just overlooked. I thought, surely this new change is way better than the old. And so, that idea that it'll be such a great change that people won't resist it because it's obviously better than the old.
Yeah.
And it just was eye-opening to recognize that, like, wow, I did not take my own approach to, talking to them about, that. And so it kind of surprised me. So,
I love that.
My sister and her husband and their kids came to visit the very first weekend. You always love guests when you just move into a house. But we proceeded to go to the big lumber yard, bought some more material, and the last thing I thought I would ever be doing was adding on to that swing set. And that's what we did the first weekend in the house. And so, but my kids appreciated it. They're like, they felt heard.
Yeah.
And they felt validated. But it really, it just really caught me off guard in terms of what, and it just echoed what I had talked about or thought about in terms of this paradigm of resistance, that sometimes it's very rational. Sometimes it's unexpected, but every bit of resistance is feedback. And so, I just kind of took the approach that I coached leaders not to take, to just kind of squelch it and just kind of, gloss over it and just be like, yeah, my kids were nervous about moving, but we didn't stop to think that sometimes it's the small things that employees hold on to, and some of those traditions need to be maintained or, transitioned. And so that's why I really like Bridges' work around the transitions of change. And how there is that, even when it's a great change, there's loss associated with that. So, like, even when somebody wins the lottery, there's things that they lose from that, and we oftentimes don't really take time to allow the organization to process that or to grieve that, or, and so, so I start the book with that story.
Yeah, it's so empowering. It's so powerful, and just I love the fact that you still kept what was old and familiar, but brought it in a different way. So they still could enjoy that narrative and those adventures, but in a new playground, right? In a new whole set of a backyard structure. And the title of your book suggests or implies that embracing or seeking resistance kind of feels paradoxical in nature. Is that because organizations or people facilitating change, they typically want to solve for, close out, avoid, shun resistance? Is that typically why?
Yeah. The book originated from a research paper that I wrote for a conference a number of years ago. I mean, like 10 years ago. And it was around this construct of resistance. And what I had found in my consulting work was that leaders tended to just either ignore resistance and treat it as something to just be avoided at all cost, or if it arose, to just squash it down really quick. And I just, I had enough of a background in psychology, and I've always been drawn to like appreciative inquiry and some of the positive psychology field. And so I thought, no, I think there's value in resistance. It's data. And it's part of human beings. We like predictability. We like the safety of knowing what's going to happen. And so when you get resistance, it should be embraced. It's part of the human condition. And so what would it look like if we were to simultaneously embrace resistance and avoid resistance, and that paradox, and so the paradox of embracing resistance to change was kind of born. Somebody came up to me after the presentation at the conference and said, this is really a cool idea. You need to expand this into a book.
Mm-hmm.
The seed was planted. It took me a long time. It kind of sat on the back burner. I'd collect stories. I'd start, develop, the model began to evolve out of both my teaching and consulting work and thinking about what does this look like? So,
how do you both seek and avoid resistance at the same time?
Well, in the book, I provide kind of a laundry list of things that you can do, some strategies for doing both, but really it comes down to, I think, a lot of change happens through conversations, through interactions. And so having open dialogue around what resistance might there be, what resistance is occurring. I've always thought that you can do a lot more with frustration or anger than you can apathy.
Mm.
There's a line from a song by the Lumineers that says, the opposite of love's not hate, it's indifference.
Yeah, love that.
And so that's really what, that. So if you have the people pushing back, find out what they're pushing back against.
Mm-hmm.
So seeking out the resistance and having people, like, there's always going to be somebody that wants to complain. So make them the devil's advocate. Give them that role. But intentionally when you're first talking about a change effort, asking for pushback, asking what are we missing here? What are we going to give up? What are we not seeing? And getting all those voices. And so seeking resistance in that sense, but then also avoiding resistance by engaging people in the process early on. People rarely resist their own change. And so people really don't resist change as much as they resist being forced to change. And so, it's kind of like we just recently bought a new vehicle. And so think back when you were, 15 or 16, buying your first car. Buying a car is exciting.
Mm-hmm.
Being sold a car is not.
No.
And so, I cringe when leaders talk about, well, we have to sell the change. And it's like, sales approaches rarely work.
Yeah.
Or that we need to get buy-in. And so it's like, that's again, the sales approach. And so you don't want necessarily people to buy into the change. You want them to really be part of the change. And so, I think the words that we use and the language that we use really matters.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm a huge fan of things like the Appreciative Inquiry Summit or World Cafe or appreciative interviewing. I think there's a lot of power in storytelling, and just the notion that if you get a group of people, all of us are smarter than any one of us. And so that's kind of, I feel like I've just kind of rambled on here, but
no. This is all great. I noticed a lot of influence from positive psychology in your book, and I could really appreciate that. I did my master's thesis or capstone presentation in positive psychology on psychological capital, so I can really appreciate the influence of reframing a challenge as an opportunity or something that may be perceived as a challenge or a threat as an opportunity in that sense. And one of the things that you noted in your book was around naming the elephant, which is kind of like what you would do if you are seeking resistance, right? Or you then get all the resistance gathered together and then you just name it. Is that what kind of how it would work?
Yeah, because it's there. I was just having this discussion with a couple of students the other evening in a Zoom chat about how around this change, around the resistance part, and I was sharing the story of how there was a senior leader that was frustrated a couple months into a change effort, and finally just sent out an email and said this in some town hall meetings. We're done debating this. There's no more disagreement. You're either on board or you're out. The
Mm.
train's leaving the station, and you're either on the train or you're off the train. And I thought, boy, that's really not real healthy. And so it really shut down the dissent, but it also shut down any creative ideas. It shut down, um, the resistance was still there. It just went underground.
Mm. It stopped
And
being surface. So then you can't
being surfaced,
address
yeah.
problems. You can't prevent future problems.
I had an HR person years ago tell me that the only thing worse than having a disgruntled employee quit, a good employee that's productive, having them quit and leave is having them quit and stay.
Mm. Because it's
And,
like a bad apple, right? And if it affects, it's like contagion and it goes out and ripples out.
yeah, and it's especially if the person was, a good employee and was productive and was rational. I talk about that in the book too, the difference between rational resistance and irrational resistance. And it's important to kind of distinguish between the two.
Mm-hmm.
I also talk about how there's healthy resistance and unhealthy resistance. And the same as there's healthy avoidance and there's unhealthy avoidance. And so differentiating those different components, I think, is important.
Well, let's unpack that. So, what is the difference between rational and irrational resistance?
So rational resistance would be like, a group of employees saying, okay, I understand this change that the top has come up with, but have they considered how it's going to affect this manufacturing process that they're not aware of?
Mm-hmm.
Or have they thought about talking to these suppliers? Because what we're hearing from the suppliers is they're not equipped for this change. And so that type of pushback is rational. It's based upon data that maybe the leadership team doesn't have.
And it's helpful, right?
That's why getting the whole group in the room, people, I mentioned the story in the book about how this organization introduced wanted people to volunteer for this effort, and there was silence and they couldn't figure out why. And the larger culture of the community was going through a large layoff in the industry. There were a lot of warn notices that had gone out,
Mm-hmm.
and they couldn't figure out, well, we're not in that same industry. Well, but half the people in the room had family members that were. And so they completely just thought that the resistance was irrational, but it was very rational because it was based upon, some fears are founded.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but part of that too is validating people's feelings, and giving people a platform to be heard and seen. Sometimes irrational resistance is where people just are maybe pushing back because they didn't get their way, or they don't want to give up what they perceive as power. They don't want to share information. Even after having a voice and sharing their ideas, they still continue to kind of resist. I use the phrase, jettison the unhealthy resistance. And so, just dealing with that in a very honest and caring way, but kind of what I call caring confrontations.
Mm-hmm. So, how would an organization then manage individuals who are showing up with irrational or unhealthy resistance then? Because I feel like you had mentioned one of the characteristics of irrational resistance is they, even after being given a platform or a stage to voice their and express their concerns, they still continue to resist. So what would an organization do in that situation?
I think there's a lot of avenues there. There's coaching, there's
Mm-hmm.
there's performance plans.
Yeah.
I think having honest conversations and maybe even saying, maybe there's a different department that would be a better fit for you, or maybe this project that's directly impacted by the change is not a good spot for you right now. Maybe even leaving the organization might be an option. I think that like just flat out firing people rarely works unless somebody is just completely being um, dangerous to the organization.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a big believer in second chances, in coaching, and giving people the opportunity to self select out. You
Mm.
know, if they see that they're just not a fit, and they're, yeah, those are some of those most difficult conversations. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
um, and that's why I think taking the time on the front end to really have good selection methods, really taking the time to um, make sure people are a good fit for the culture of the organization.
Yeah. It all goes back to that beginning, right, of the employee life cycle, the selection and hiring process. If they're not a fit,
Yeah.
then they're just going to always feel out of place as you continue to evolve as an organization.
I had a colleague who he had some senior leadership experience, and his mantra was to hire slow and fire fast.
Mm.
And he said that most organizations do just the opposite. They hire fast and then they fire slow.
That's so
And,
true.
and so, yeah, taking the time to really get the right person on board, um, that's the culture fit. Um, but a lot of times organizations are just desperate. We just need a body. We just need to get somebody
Mm.
in, or they find somebody that has great technical skills and they think that's what we need. And then they get them in the organization and they're not a culture fit.
Mm-hmm.
They don't embrace the core values of the organization. And I think that we miss out on that. And so
I think
so
it's even fair in that part of the process to start sharing the expectations around change up front too, right? Just kind of priming and conditioning them for, hey, this is an organization that is changing and growing exponentially. We adapt to change, we embrace change. It's not something that we shy away from. Is that something that you can see yourself being a part of? Is that something that maybe you think it wouldn't be an environment you'd like to be a part of, and giving them the option to self-select out from the beginning, right?
yeah, I think it's kind of like in an interpersonal relationship. It's like we avoid conflict because it's uncomfortable,
Mm,
but it doesn't go away. Just you're just prolonging the inevitable. And so, um, there's healthy conflict and there's unhealthy conflict, but conflict avoidance is not it's not a good strategy.
mm-mm.
I mean, and I can speak to firsthand experience in terms of my personal life. And so, um, but yeah, we oftentimes are like, I don't want to confront them because it'll be really awkward. And it's like, it's not going to go away. It's kind of
Mhm.
like, it's like your car making a noise.
Mm.
I remember, I remember my first car. I was not mechanical. I mean, that's, my older brother's an engineer. So I remember him riding in my car with me one time, and I was probably 17 or 18. And he's like, "What is that noise?" And I'm like, "What?" And he goes, "Well, turn the radio down." And he goes, "Do you hear that noise?" And I'm like, "Well, I kind of knew it was there, but I just play the radio louder." And
Wow.
he's like, it's not going to go away. It's not like a cold where you can just kind of like, okay, the
Ride it
cold,
out.
it's not going to heal. It's not going to get better. And so, but I think organizations kind of take that same, like, and I think even sometimes leaders feel like, um, did you ever see the movie Office Space?
No.
Oh my gosh, it's such a sad take on organizational life, but it's really funny. There's one character in there, Melvin, who they want to get rid of, and so they just like cut off his paycheck.
Is this the one when they bring in a consultant, like
Yes,
okay.
yeah, the two Bobs.
I have a colleague who every time I see him in person, he's like, "Have you watched The Office Space yet? You're the person that comes in." And I'm like, if this is painting OD consultant in a bad
Yeah,
way.
yeah. So they're like, "Did you fire Melton?" And it's like, "Well, we fixed it." Like, what do you mean you fixed it? It's like, "Well, we cut off his paycheck," and like he'll get the idea, And it's like it's such a strange way to like I mean, it's funny. It's
Hmm.
over the top hilarious in that sense, but there's an element of truth to it. And I think that's true of a lot of humor.
Yeah.
It's like organizations are just hoping that, if we mistreat the person bad enough, or, they move him to this little closet and they just keep moving him to a smaller and smaller office, spot, hoping that he'll just get enough disgruntled that he'll leave. And I
Hmm.
think organizations kind of do the same thing. They hope they'll just run off the employee instead of talking to him.
Yeah.
And that just creates a really unhealthy relationship. And the message
Addressing it,
sends to the other employees.
yeah, addressing it early and often, right? That's the idea, that's probably the best approach. But because if not, then it's like a snowball effect back to your car. It starts small and then it grows, and then before you know it, it's an avalanche, and you're now handling more than just the individual that was directly, having the issue. And now it's maybe multiple people, or maybe the issue's gotten larger. And it brings me to a question I have around this expression, the how does it go? I'm going to butcher this. The squeakiest wheel gets the, do you know what I'm
Grease.
talking, the
And
grease?
the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And so,
Yeah. So how does that kind of fit into your concept or paradigm around resistance? Because we do see that sometimes in organizations too, where you have a culture where it's like, maybe they're not trying to shut well, yeah, they're trying to shut down the resistance really quickly, right? So it doesn't get out. But it's like, okay, we implement this new change, it's going okay, and then we hear the same squeaky, noise from the same people from all the changes that we've seen happen over and over. And what, like, everyone else seems to be fine, it's just this one person, so it makes it feel like there's a bigger issue than there is potentially. Maybe the change is fine, maybe it's really not. And I think it's probably, I'm answering my own question, it's probably that irrational resistance, right?
yeah, sometimes it's just a personality difference. There's some
Mm,
people that they're always going to push back, or even if they've been
mm,
involved from the beginning, it's still not going to be a fit. They're still not going to necessarily agree. And and that's where you have to be able to manage conflict in a healthy way,
mm,
and set healthy boundaries in terms of what is tolerated and what's not tolerated, and to do that in a way that is respectful but doesn't just squelch dissent. So there's healthy dissent and there's unhealthy dissent, and you know it's hard to define, but you kind of know it when you see it. I think that the point, one of the main points of the book, is that to not just treat all resistance as something to be squelched,
mm,
and not to see any disagreement as wrong or unhealthy, or have it perceived as being what's the word I'm looking for, insubordinate.
mhm,
Having a culture where people can tell the leader they have a different view,
mhm.
kind of tell the emperor they have no clothes,
Yeah.
and so having that type of trusting environment, it's not easy to create. It goes back to the culture fit again. And so
And the leaders modeling that culture too, right? And the examples that they set. um
I think one of the things that happens
mhm,
too is leaders are really, either because of time pressures, or they feel that they don't want to burden employees, so they they push through a change effort. They feel like they know what needs to happen, and so they don't want to get people's opinions, either because they don't want the dissent, or they don't want to maybe not have their way go forward, or they feel like that's their job as the leader to have all the answers. And and you see that with new leaders a lot of times. They feel like, well, I was brought in to be a change agent, so I'm introducing all this change. And so they're, I don't know if it's a lack of confidence or fear that drives some leaders to not engage people in that process and ask for views early on, because it's like, well, what if they don't like the idea, or what if it's like, well, maybe they don't like it because it's not a great idea.
mhm,
Or if it, having the confidence to be able to say, you know what, this is a smart group. We've got smart people here. Why not hear their views? You know, but I think that's a leadership style that I think is really not always present.
And if there is resistance, assume positive intent, right? Assume
Right.
that they aren't coming from a bad place, that either they're close to where the change is happening and they can provide some helpful information, or they just have some fears that need to be worked through, and coaching can potentially support.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it comes down to the mental models that we have, that either leaders have or the organization has, and
Hmm.
some of those mental models are counterproductive.
Well, how do you fix that?
Boy, that's why that's at the root of like systems thinking, is
Yeah.
getting way below the water level, and how do we shift paradigms? And that's where the hard work takes place.
I did
Uh,
not plan that, if anyone's listening. Shift paradigm. See, it works. But yeah, it's
oh my gosh!
so ground. You just
I just now
realized.
I just saw that your logo up above the
Mhm.
cameras where it says paradigm shifts, and I'm like, I didn't either. I promise I did not, like, that was not a setup.
It's subliminal messaging. I'm in psychology too. No, it was not planned, but I think that's a great way of saying, we have to sometimes, if you see a pattern of behavior in an organization, which is what makes up culture, and you express this as well in the book, is you have to, if you see that pattern in a way that doesn't support where you want to go, you have to get to that roots level. You have to dig into the systems thinking and really try to solve for those issues, or else you're going to continue getting the same thing, right? It's that cycle of chaos. And if you don't do something different, you're going to continue the same way that you've been.
Yeah, and that's, when you think about that from a system standpoint, you think about, Chris Argyris's idea of double loop learning.
Mm.
That key part of that double loop is the reflection piece, and the challenging assumptions. And the assumptions are where you get to the paradigms and the mental models, and challenging the assumptions is really where you embrace the resistance. You say, okay, what are some of our assumptions that we're making?
Mm.
And and a lot of times the dissenting views are a reflection of your assumptions that you're not even aware of.
Mm.
And so when somebody is pushing back, it's like, okay, what are they seeing that I'm not seeing?
Yeah, because it's coming from somewhere, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Most, I think that not all behavior, but a lot of behavior is goal directed,
Mm.
and it may not seem rational, but to the person, it's very rational. And I'll give you an odd example. I think it's a great example, but a number of years ago, we were doing foster care, and when we were going through a lot of the foster care system, and we had two different sets of sisters, and that's just been a really powerful backstory for my kids when they were growing up. But there was one family that we were close to that had a boy that was in the foster care system, and he was like 9 or 10, and he kept getting into serious trouble with the law,
Hmm.
and they kept showing up in juvenile court with him, and the judge was asking him, why are you back here again?
Yeah.
And the boy was just really defiant. But it turned out that he was being very deliberate with his actions, because the only time he got to see his mom and dad was when they went to court for his continued coming before the
Wow.
judge. And so he figured out that if I get in trouble and they take me to court, my not just my foster parents, but my real parents will have to show up, and I'll get to see them in court.
So that behavior was being rewarded.
It
Yeah.
was. It was very goal directed. And
Yeah.
so, it could have seemed irrational. It could have seemed, oh, that's something we just need to squash. But it was good data. I mean, and so in terms of like that child resisting the structures that were put on him, you know, it made sense once they stepped back and kind of uncovered what was behind the behavior. And so, and I think that's just a good depiction of human behavior in general.
In general. And how do you reroute those behaviors? By setting up reward systems that reward the right behaviors,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
which is another thing, right? Rewards and recognitions in companies
Yeah.
too, and
Yeah.
incentives and performance management and all that good stuff. But
Yeah. And I actually had somebody one time that said, you don't need all that. You don't need a pat on the back. You don't need, you know, encouragement. That's what the paycheck's for.
hmm, interesting. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs just completely out the window.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, yeah, there's so much to that. Is there anything else in your book that you think it has really just come to life for you after you've written it, while you've been working with organizations?
You know, one of the things that came up early on when I was working on the book and was talking to a couple of different book editors, one of them said, "Well, um, it would be really helpful if there were like specific steps, like
Hmm.
Cotter's model." And I said, "Well, it's not a linear change model." And they're like,
Mm,
"Well, but people like linear models." And I'm like, "Just because they like them doesn't mean that it's effective." And I said that the model is very circular. It doesn't really have a beginning or end.
yeah.
And I really try in the book to talk about how it supplements or integrates with other change models, whether it's Kurt Lewin's, you know, simple 3-phase, you know, of unfreeze, change, refreeze, or Cotter's change model, which is very well known.
Yeah.
It dovetails with those. It's not a linear model, but it is a great supplement. It's a methodology or tool or mindset that overlays well with other change models that organizations are using, like the ProSci one. That one's it fits with that one too. So it's not a model meant to replace those other change models, but it's more of a mental model or a visual to look specifically at the construct of resistance and kind of how that applies to early stages of a change effort, to the middle, to the late stages. So
Hmm.
it's a very nonlinear model.
I mean, it's a whole paradigm of how to think about resistance in general. And I agree. I think it could elevate or be added to other um, change models, certainly. And I've had this conversation in the past because I'm ProSci certified. The change model isn't necessarily as important as how you apply it, right? That's not necessarily when you are facilitating a change effort. In my experience, maybe others do it differently. I have to sometimes switch in other change models and switch out what I was, initially starting with, or sometimes I take pieces of other ones and add it in solely because of maybe language that's used that isn't necessarily being understood in our organization. Maybe there's some language that you use to talk about change champions in one model and another language for how we talk about change champions in another model that would be better accepted, right?
Yeah, I think that's a great example. I think too. I like to draw the distinction between um, like change management versus project management.
Mm,
And that's why I think I love the field of organization development. Is it takes a much different approach than some of the traditional change management approaches, which to me are very much rooted in project management.
hmm.
You know, I've taught project management classes before at the college level, so I understand the value of it, particularly like on an operations side. Um, and so having project management skills is invaluable, but there's more to change than managing a project. You know, when I
Yeah.
think about someone saying, "Okay, we're going to use Cotter's model, and so here's our Gantt chart, and we're going to spend this many weeks doing the build a coalition. We're going to spend this many weeks dealing with this phase," and they
Hmm.
make it very neat and tidy. And it's like, okay, this project's going to take 18 months because that's and it's kind of like, okay, we're going to allow 2 weeks for resistance, then the resistance is going to be gone, and then we're going to allow 1 week for implementing this, and I think the challenge is that looking at um, the change process more than just discrete steps,
Mm,
and so there's a difference between the technical side of the change, like implementing a new human resource information system.
Mm.
That's a big change effort. So there is a project management aspect to that, of like, when are you going to do the beta testing? When's the next release going to be available? Who's going to implement it? How do we shut down the systems? So there's the project part of that, but then there's the change piece. And oftentimes the change piece kind of gets lost.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of like the field of dreams approach that, well, if we build it, everybody will come. And
I think that's well said. I think if we go into a change effort with the mindset that we're managing the change like we're managing a project, then we lose the humanistic side of it. And it feels very dehumanizing when we are helping people at the end of the day get through difficult change. And that's a lot different than meeting deadlines. People are very complex. Humans are very unpredictable, and every single person has their unique individual footprint or blueprint. So it's not something you can slide into a Gantt chart and track on a weekly basis, to your point. So that was well said. I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges is, like if you have a department that's over, that's the tech group, and they're the ones that are over installing some new software system. That's their expertise.
Right.
There's, they might have somebody that understands, change from a human system standpoint, but probably not. And so they're going to approach it very much from a technical, this is a technical problem to be solved. We're going to implement these steps. And then when there's pushback, they're like, oh, people just hate change. They just, they don't like technology. They don't want to have to use something new. And so oftentimes in that setting, nobody's really stepping back and thinking, how does this change? How does it mesh with the culture? If the rest of the organization is really embedded in having a voice and being very collaborative, but then that change is not done in a collaborative way. And oftentimes it's like, well, it just seemed obvious. We needed it. It had to happen. It was going to a new version. And so just because it had to happen doesn't mean it had to be done in a unilateral, non-collaborative way.
Right. Or didn't require some upfront thoughts around how to, include the human side of the people side of it. I feel lucky the organization that I work for, and you and I have had this conversation on one of your podcast episodes, is that for us, the company that I work for for the size that it is, fairly small. They figured that out pretty quickly, right? When they did a change and it didn't see adoption, it didn't see success, that it required us really thinking through, okay, how do we help people through this? Not just force it on them, but really, and also get their feedback, get their ideas about how to make it even better, because chances are they know what the best way or the best outcome, the most efficient, effective way would be at the end of the day.
Yeah. I've been impressed with the things that you've shared about your organization. It's a great model to, if more organizations would kind of emulate that, I think we would all be better off.
Yeah. And, it seems kind of digestible when it's a smaller company. Now just imagine like how you do that at scale with companies that are 10,000 people and not lose that human side of it. And I think that's probably where you have, hopefully, organizations see the value of bringing change management professionals in early, OD consultants in early and often to think through all of that.
Yeah, that idea of scalability,
Oof.
It's like people are like, well, it must be nice having a big organization because you have the resources and you have an OD department or you have the expertise. And it's like, yeah, but with that comes some of the complexity of the scale, and not just complexity, but complicated, kind of the difference between something being complicated versus complex. And so smaller organizations may be less complex or complicated, but then they struggle with not having that in-house expertise. And so there's not a one size magic formula.
No, it's not a software solution. You can just click a button and it applies a change equally across. So I have one final question for you to wrap up, and I ask this of
Okay.
all of my guests. So my question is, and it's very relatable to the
It's not one of those train problems about a train leaves Cleveland and you have
no
to
solve
go back.
for X and no.
Okay.
What was the speed that they were traveling at? No. So my question for you is, what's the most recent paradigm shift that you've experienced, whether it's related to your book, to the work that you do, or anything outside of that?
Boy, you put me on the spot.
I know.
This will have to be one to think about, but I'll just try to see if I can come up with one off the top of my head.
Yeah.
I think that I would say, and I'll mention one of my favorite authors, but Brene Brown
Love her.
and her work. I think it's really shifting how we view leadership and how we view kind of the role of compassion and empathy and vulnerability. I think that idea of the leader having all the answers, and I remember years ago in my teaching, I've always started my classes with quotes, and a quote that I used to use that I have just like completely abandoned because I realize how unhealthy a view it is. But the quote was that a frightened captain makes for a frightened crew. And the idea was that you have to be fearless as a leader. You can't show any self-doubt. You can't show, and that might have been true back in the, 1600s when you're on a sailing vessel and nobody really knew where you were going. And nobody, there were all these myths about, sea creatures. And so like if the captain showed self-doubt, then you lost the crew. But we're so far past that. And so, but I think there's still those organizations that feel like the leader has to have all the answers. The leader can't be vulnerable. They can't show any self-doubt.
They have to have it all together, right? If you're in a leader role, you have to have it all together.
Yeah. And so I think that people like Brene Brown are kind of leading that shift of a healthier type of leadership, of a more collaborative organization. Now, I say that, but then I look at some of the things that are happening on a global stage, and I struggle with that because there's certainly leaders around the world that are not leading in that way. And so I see some of the major crises that we're faced with, and I sometimes struggle to think, well, is that too naive? But I still remain hopeful. I still think there's more good in people than there is bad.
I'm on the hopeful boat with you as well, Jim. And I think maybe that Brené's paradigm just hasn't shifted out far enough. It's too early on. And maybe it just needs a little bit more spreading. And before you know it, hopefully we'll find the right leaders in the right places.
Yeah, it's that shift, and it doesn't happen immediately. That's why that word shift is so good. So
powerful. Well, thank you so much for this chat. This has been a pleasure.
I've really enjoyed it. Yeah. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for, sharing the book with your listeners and just asking me to share that story. It's like anytime I can talk about my kids or stories, they've been some of my best teachers.
Yeah. It paints the picture so well. So thank you for being such an artist at sharing your stories around change and helping us all see it a little bit differently. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, you have a wonderful rest of your day.
You too. Bye.
Take care.
Thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to leave a review, rate, and subscribe wherever you're listening. If you know a business leader in practice or friend who you think would be interested in this episode, please consider sharing it with them. I'm so grateful for your support. For more updates, you can follow us at Paradigm Shifts Podcast on Instagram. See you on the next episode.